From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
All right. Everybody comfy? Everybody happy? Everybody ready for an International Women's Day treat? I'm just going to introduce myself because I want to maximize the time that I have with all of you. I could not be more honored and delighted to have the opportunity to speak in the Library of Congress about my area of specialization on Women's Day in Women's History Month at a moment when women of Congress are on strike and marching out. It's just a great day to celebrate feminist voices raised. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about who I am and what I do, about the exhibit that I have in the Jefferson Building. Thanks to Meg Metcalf, who's assisted me in bringing so much to display and exhibit. And then I'm going to play you a bunch of little samples with this ancient item that's called a tape player from the 20th century. And I'll explain what all the ephemera is that I schlepped up to Capitol Hill, bewildering people on Metro. So I'm a women's history professor, and I am part-time at GW, part-time at Georgetown for 22 years. And my area of interest in women's history is the women's music movement of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And this is a much misunderstood phenomenon, which is now just old enough to start being archived and made into a sort of a serious topic of study. And it's a very awkward moment because there's been critical backlash against what are, for me, very beloved institutions like the Michigan Women's Music Festival, and a lot of interrogation of how inclusive women's music was. It always has been, and we're also in Washington, D.C., very much connected to local institutions, people, artists that made women's music the success it is. Olivia Records was founded just a few miles from here. DC is the base of Sweet Honey in the Rock, which just lost its premier sign language interpreter, Mama Shirley. So we're very sad about her passing, and I dedicate today's talk to her. We're located near one of the best one-day festivals that was ever organized, and that was Sister Fire, produced by Amy Horowitz and Roadwork. Bowden Sandstrom started the first women's sound company here. This is a really rich region for looking at people, places, and things in women's music. And what I want to do is try to make this a more visible and serious topic of scholarly inquiry and popular appreciation. And I've been introducing soundtracks in my lectures for a really long time, and traveling around the country doing readings from articles I've done, interviews with artists, histories of different women's production companies, and what I have is only a tiny inch of what is in my house right now. I have one of the best archives in the United States of this whole subject. And beginning at the end of January, I was permitted to have a display in the Great North Hall of a couple of glass cases showing a little bit of the timeline of feminist music and sound. And I'm going to try and expand on that. I brought a few more things from my house. But at your leisure, you can go over there and look at what kind of begins with suffrage protest music and goes right through to punk. And there's fantastic items from, of course, the Library of Congress collection. And they include the sheet music to Loretta Lynn's The Pill, as well as some of the original albums by Alex Dobkin and some of the zines that were the only media to promote women's music. Hot Wire, Paid My Dues. And we also have on display some recordings by the group Betty, DC-based trio of dynamic women. So I'm going to just start a little bit, oh my gosh, with the origins of women's music. And what I have out on the table is pretty self-explanatory, but I'll explain anyway. We really begin with drumming. Drumming is one of the most ancient of the ways that women created sound, very much like the heartbeat and the baby that lies on the womb, but also often off limits to women who were not permitted to join male-only rituals, celebrations, and drum training. And that remains a very frustrating issue for many women in different tribes globally, from the South Pacific to Africa. And in the spaces around band instrumental training, we find women turning to the obvious lullabies and passing along to their babies both soothing sounds and whispered information. Whispered information that was often, in a secret language where women even weren't permitted the regular language of the men. That was very true in my personal heritage, Jewish tradition, where in Eastern Europe, men spoke of serious things in Hebrew and women said rude things about guys in Yiddish. And the Yiddish lullabies are filled with despair about the unreliability of men. And that was considered a women's language, or the mama lotion. And I'll give you a little sample of that in a minute. By the time we get to the Middle Ages, what we have is a curious issue where women are composing sacred music, and it's very beautiful. As nuns, they can go to a convent or a sisterhood of living different kinds, the Beguines, or a different kind of convent. They were allowed to own property and eventually leave. But all of these women were forbidden to sing in front of men. And by really pretty early in history, there's a ban on men listening to women's voices with the idea that it could turn them, arouse them, what have you. One of the few contemporary artifacts about this is from a Hasidic community that I studied in grad school. Rabbinic Advisory, Woman Singing. Okay, so this would be on an album warning young religious men, don't buy this album, there are women on it, Okay, yeah, I know. So we have, let's say, compositions by someone like Hildegard of Bingen, and her recordings are available to us now. If I could find them. Here we go. And this is she's obviously not really available to us at, DIR Constitution Hall right now, but she's reminded, we have access to her recordings through compilations. This is called Joan of Arc, and it's all music that was dedicated to Mary from the Middle Ages, and it includes some of Hildegard's compositions and other songs about the hardship of being a female. By the time we get to the Middle Ages and a little bit after, we also have well-known songs that are passed woman to woman that are very much about the trauma of an unplanned pregnancy. So many women were burned as witches. So many women were charged with deviant, sinful behavior and burned at the stake. And one of my colleagues and friends in grad school, Deb Simons, did her dissertation on Scots ballads about illegitimate birth and infanticide, and that's the book on the table that's called Weep Not For Me. Those songs were very much trickling down into contemporary folk tunes, and that's something that's familiar to many of you from Mary Hamilton's Birth to Babe. And, the Queen says, "Get up, Mary Hamilton, get up and follow me, for I am gone to Edinburgh Tune, and I'm going to, tell the King and Queen about your situation." That is all over England and Ireland. So it's an indication that women were singing about their situations to each other. It was just rarely written down, and it was a warning to younger women. So we have sort of proto-feminist music that's about the reality of the body and the reality of living conditions in particular all over the world where there's constant warfare. There are absent men that women pine for, and then there are men who come in and they invade physically. And those realities are captured in song. And obviously, in the American version, what we have in the early America are slave songs and songs of survival and struggle and escape. And the people who have studied slave songs and work songs, of course, have done enormous, meticulous research on what was the music that was actually a map to the Underground Railroad and how to navigate to freedom by looking at the stars. And the most famous example there is Follow the Drinking Gourd. And of course, that's the Big Dipper. And I always get chills whenever I speak about that. That's such an important piece of our musical history. So by the time we get to the era of immigration, we start to get scratchy recorded music a little bit. And there's one group, Labana, that has done a sort of recreation of sweatshop songs by women more than 100 years ago. And these are in Yiddish, and I'll just play you a tiny sample. A woman is saying, "I'm so exhausted. When am I going to sleep? This is never ending. I'm always going to be, a tailor." Okay. Sorry, I can't do more than just a little bit. I have so much stuff. But I can talk about anything that you hear today that interests you. I'll be happy to go on for quite a while. When we get to the era of suffrage, we actually have down in the other exhibit some sheet music from Suffrage Songs, which are just fantastic. And World War I is a great time to study opinionated women, because there were women who were for the war, against the war, women who said, "I don't even want to talk about the war, let's get the vote first before I lift a finger for Wilson." And one of my favorite songs is "Who Dares to Put a Musket on His Shoulder," which was a women's complaint that without the vote or any political input, she was having to sacrifice her sons. Mothers were very hostile to the Great War because it introduced 3 horrifying new weapons of warfare no one had ever seen before: the machine gun, mustard gas, which was the beginning of chemical warfare, and then the U-boat, the Untersee boat that could, of course, sink pleasure ships like the Lusitania. And so suffrage songs are the first sort of recorded feminist music in terms of how we see the first wave and the second wave and so forth. But a lot of that is specific to a kind of community of activist white women. Over here, we also have eventually the Harlem Renaissance, which is going to record very outspoken blues and living outside the law, songs of survival from African American women, a lot of gay women, and people meeting in speakeasies where they really could speak easy. So the interesting thing about Prohibition is it brought black and white, straight and gay together, because everyone was a criminal as soon as you wanted a drink, and that was a great equalizer. So one of the most marvelous things that I found is an example of a party mixtape that someone put together and I bought from a catalog when I was 15, and it's called Reefer Songs. This is Trixie Smith saying, "I'm so high." Little contrast to Yiddish suffering. We could just get them together, I'm so high, I'm so high.
I'm sailing in the sky. Just blow some gauge, come on around, baby. Jack, I'm mellow. I'm so high and so dry. I'm way up in the sky. The world seems light and I'm so right. Jack, I'm mellow. I'm gonna put my nickel in a slot machine and play my solid cinder. I'm gonna start packing Susie Q. Cause I'm on a bender. I'm so high and so dry. I'm sailing in the sky. I got my roots round, I can't come down. Jack, I'm mellow.
All right, kind of fun. But oopsie, you could also end up busted and go to jail. So I have those two. We'll deal with the replay here. All right. This is from Smithsonian Folkways. No, Rosetta Records. Okay. This is Jailhouse Blues, and this is an amazing compilation from the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. It's from 1936, and this would be a women's penitentiary where the women were put at hard labor, and a lot of the songs are about relationships, people who sold them out, and then there's songs that are original, composed behind bars, and then there are work songs that allow women to, like Man on a Chain Gang or on Railroad, use rhythm and chanting to focus on repetitive tasks that you can't say no to.
When the blue sea with the mountains on my back, I conquered all the lines, and I even tried the pounders back.
Here we go.
Hey, Logan, 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 so my partner, in that new ground, one with another one, just like the other one. Hey, Logan, Logan, new ground, Logan, master, so my partner, in that new ground.
I really like that one. There's a lot on here that's also referential to prostitution and the inevitability of when a woman had nothing else having to sell herself and so forth. That's called Does Anyone Here Want to Buy Some Cabbage? And that's a song that could be disguised as a market song, but it's about something else. Okay. So, moving along. Thanks for your patience. I'm trying not to walk away from the mic too much. This is just the beginning of a really rich literature. Angela Davis, of course, is the one who produced that amazing textbook, which I teach, Blues, Legacies and Black Feminisms. And, of course, a lot of the material reminds us that very early in the 20s, we have women singing about loving other women. And it's been a wonderful thing in the better climate of LGBT rights for people to be able to do research on the earliest songs about women in relationships. Some of them are very sly and / overtly sexual, shocking to us today. A very popular interwar tune, which Lillian Faderman rediscovered, was called The Boy in the Boat, a euphemism for lovemaking, and it warned men who went off to the wars that while you're away, the women are swimming. Okay, and then we have the very famous Prove It On Me blues, Bessie Smith, and various other women who sang this, which not only talks about cross-dressing, but the fact that unless you're caught, nobody could prove you were gay and get you into trouble with the law. This is not the original, this is the cover version by Faith Nolan, who became a big, popular Afro-Canadian star of women's music. Oops, play. To do it upside down, too.
When I last night had a great big fight, everything seemed to go on.
Come on.
You gotta blow on it.
Yeah. Oh my God. Hang on. Some of these tapes are pretty old. Well.
Hold it up to the mic.
Must have been women 'cause I don't like men. It's true, I wear a collar and a tie. Love to watch the women when they walk by. Okay. Sorry, this is a tape of a tape of a tape, and this is what we do. Okay. Everything else is more or less original. And, of course, people also send me stuff because they know I'm interested. Okay. This is great. The era of the 20s, 30s, we have women really speaking out. They're talking about being in love with women. They're dealing with abuse from men. They're fighting back. How do you earn a living? How do you live outside the law? How do you deal with segregation? We're all familiar with the song Strange Fruit about lynching. But despite the inevitability of separating women under Jim Crow law, we actually have another moment of very positive integration beyond drinking in illegal clubs. That is World War II. When the men go away, so do many of the big band players, and they're drafted, and women substitute. And one of the greatest stories, of course, is the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, which was a mixed-race band, very daring, very difficult for them to find places to stay on the road. They included a very famous trumpet player, Tiny Davis, who was very in love with her partner, Ruby, and there's a whole video about their lives called Tiny and Ruby, Hell Diving Women, and they are just fabulous. That is the subject of quite a number of films and commentary, but I'll give you a little bit of their coolness. Let's get a little bit more of the whole band. It's an all-female orchestra. That's Tiny Davis. Okay, so you can see that we have not a straight line, but a wavy line of female empowerment leading right up to where people think women's music begins, which is with the folk protest songs of the 1950s. And on the table, I have a tribute to some other blues women, but I also have the memoir by the recently deceased Ronnie Gilbert, who performed with the Weavers. Great lady, and of course they were blacklisted and investigated actually by the House Un-American Activities Committee. That was the beginning of a folk revival where many people, because of the investigation of our government, became alerted to folk concerts were a great place to meet other progressives or to dare to mix interracially. There was not very much of a effective gay rights movement at that point. There was the beginnings, though, of a civil rights protest movement that would bring people out of the house to see difference as less frightening. And in this era, we have a couple of women who really emerge as recognizable figures, and that would include Malvina Reynolds, Little Boxes, and she did a song called We Don't Need the Men, and a whole lot of commentary on what she saw as conformity in the era and the need for people to rise. And after that, the cat is out of the bag, so to speak. So where I sort of come into this history would be at the beginning of the 1960s with peace marching parents who never stopped playing Joan Baez albums. And through the voices of women in the house, I came to recognize union songs, anti-war music, music about women who had lost men to war, draft resistance. Eventually, Judy Collins, much later on, actually recorded a song about having an abortion. That was not something I heard as a kid, but a lot of those vocalizations made it possible for me to naturally respond to women's music when it sort of begins in the 70s. So what do we call women's music? Women's music revives in the early 70s as a kind of response to the belittlement of women in rock and roll, where many women were treated as groupies, as sex objects. There were a lot of otherwise, radical and hip male bands that sang about women in sexually demeaning ways. A really good example of the beloved Rolling Stones. Under My Thumb, yeah, there's a problem with that. And even my beloved Led Zeppelin. Way down inside, I'm going to give you every inch of my love. Really? Okay. So anyhow, the response to that was that women began to compose songs about their lives that were original and that investigated the issues of the day. And one of the first was Mountain Moving Day, and that album is out there. That was 1972, and that was the New Haven and Chicago women's liberation rock bands. And those are a combination of songs about sexual harassment, contraception, abuse in the home, talking back to patriarchy. It's just thrilling. And the title, the symbolic, the mountain is awake and the women are on the move. That followed a commercially successful all-women's band, Fanny, with June Millington, who now runs a rock and roll camp for girls in Massachusetts, as a top 40 hit. But the feminist music begins in 72. And then in 73, we get Olivia Records. And that is the great story that has brought me into activism. The story of Olivia is that a collective of women living in the Furies house here in D.C., who were radical lesbian separatists, interviewed a visiting performer, Chris Williamson, on Georgetown's Radio Free Woman program. And during that interview, Chris Williamson sort of turned the tables on the women interviewing her and said, well, what do you do? And the Furies said, well, everything we do is about women. We want to create institutions for women. We want women to be able to do things on their own without relying on men. And on the air, Chris said, why don't you start a women's recording company? And they did the next day. So that was Olivia Records, which was the beginning of a woman-owned production company. It is now Olivia Travel and Olivia Cruises, where I often guest lecture. And that was very much under the leadership of Judy DeLugach, who's still the head of Olivia. And their interest was in trying to have concerts for women only that would be uplifting and supportive, but also which would name the ways that women were beginning to be open about loving one another. And it was a very dramatic change from what existed at the time. You had to find women who do sound and do lighting and production, and all of those skills had been off limits to women. And eventually, Bowden Sandstrom's Woman Sound Company, which she co-founded with Cassie Culver and another woman, began to do the sound for these events. And Olivia's first album, well, actually, I have some of the original 45 singles there. It's the rarest thing on the bench. They recorded Meg Christian's I Know You Know, which is a really fantastic album. And it was followed by Chris Williamson's The Changer and the Change, which to this day is the best-selling women's music album of all time. This was great, but where are these women going to perform? And who's going to review them and distribute the music? There was no coverage in the mainstream of this movement in the 70s. There was no real way to promote it without putting women at risk. As soon as it was identified as something gay, you could lose your job, your custody, your standing in church, your role in a school, everything, if you just showed up, at a Holly Near concert. So a lot of this history has a very slim paper trail, which is very frustrating to me as a historian. As things digitize, all that a researcher will find is what has been digitized so far, not the complete story. And the complete story of these recordings is women playing in other women's living rooms with the shades drawn. And it's in women's scrapbooks, it's in photos, it's in memories, it's an oral tradition, which we have to get now. So I'm real adamant about interviewing women who went to concerts and their lives were changed. And it didn't necessarily have to be about the intimacy of a relationship. A lot of what women will say saved their lives was that the women's music concert phenomena was an alternative to the bars. So it was, before Facebook, a space for the underage and the sober. The music on stage openly named everything that radio and news would not talk about, whether it was domestic violence or incest or the lack of fair wages for women, things we're still dealing with now. Being an athlete, being a mom who comes out to her kids, being somebody who is poor, learning to understand a person whose ethnicity and race is different from your own, being able to consider running for office. This doesn't really sound like you could dance to it, but actually you could. You really could, okay? A little bit of our local beloved and now missing an interpreter group, Sweetie Honey and the Rock. Here's an example of naming that stuff in a way you can move to. Hang on. By the time this is over, I'll figure out which button to push upside down. My Gordon. Okay, there we go.
Washington, and you're listening to Sophie's Parlor.
WPFW. So this is Sweet Honey in the Rock.
Women should be a priority, respected and upheld in society, given all the proper notoriety, never used or abused by authority figures, like the media that trashes us, play down the hype that constantly bashes our image. TV, movies, and the videos use women's bodies to create a sick sideshow, too many times seen as a sex symbol. No real intelligence, just a brainless symbol, not taken seriously for who she needs to be, a human being with the right to be free, not misinterpreted so much of the time. No means yes, only in a man's mind. Women who struggle and shout, take back the night, are often viewed by others in the wrong light. The daily violence of rape, don't misconstrue. It is a fact of life, and it could happen to you.
All right, that's a something, and whoopsie-daisy. Now, so what's up with WPFW? Well, this is a great little rare thing from the Washington Blade. Radio Free Women was kicked off of Georgetown because they talked about contraception on the air, and eventually that was not comfy at a Jesuit institution, one where I now teach. But anyhow, the radio station had to change so that the women moved to WPFW, and that became Sophie's Parlor, which is still a women's music show today. So that's really a wonderful tribute, again, to the power of local organizing in facilitating the growth of the women's music movement. So on the bench, what I have are a whole bunch of the albums that came out of the 70s, some of which were speech albums, and some of the rare ones include Olivia Records made an album that was poetry by Judy Grawn and Pat Parker, Where Would I Be Without You? So we have a black and a white poet reading their work on the Olivia label. There was also a March on Washington in 1979 and 87 and 93 and 2000. And there's a recorded album from the 79 March for Gay Rights, which is really the first of its kind. There was also our first recording of a festival, and that was the Sister Fire album. But in 1977, Olivia also put out a very famous album with an orange juice can on the cover, Lesbian Concentrate. And that was in response to Anita Hill's campaign to roll back gay rights protections. And that was a wonderful compilation of all of the Olivia artists at the time. That's a real collector's item now and a really fun album to play. So who was covering all of this? Hardly anyone in the press, except for two different zines. One, Paid My Dues, and then that was followed by Hotwire, and Hotwire under the direction of my friend and mentor, Tony Armstrong Jr. That I have to go and get. So what we have in the display case over in the Jefferson Building is this issue. This is my friend Sherry Hicks on the cover, who's a sign language interpreter. And each issue of Hotwire came with a sampler, so you could hear 3 or 4 cuts of, this is presuming everyone had a record player. And you could be introduced to the music. And this would cover what was going on. There's a photo of me and my mom at a women's music festival. This is an article I wrote. I brought Mom to the festival. Women's music festivals, which began in 1974 with National in Illinois and then Michigan in 1976, were able to bring all these artists together and offer you like a slate of performances that went over a whole weekend and then eventually a week. And you could hear as many concerts as came with your ticket, relax on a blanket with your loved one, go to workshops on fighting patriarchy or how to learn karate or compost. There were many more. Those are kind of the archetypes. I led quite a few on topics ranging from Jewish women's history to, journal keeping. But at festivals, many women also shared production, touring. How do you launch a career as a controversial person without much help? Even if you are one of the best artists of your time, the mainstream will not promote you. And these conversations happened for years. Of all the people who performed in festival culture, 4 became household names. And those would be the Indigo Girls, Melissa Etheridge, and Tracy Chapman. And then others have become better known, depending if you're a Canadian or in England. Jill Sobiel's a good example. But the problem, of course, was that rock media was not interested in women's music, which was considered too soft a sound or man-hating or what have you. And even our own Ms. Magazine, shocked to say, did not put Chris Williamson on the cover until 1980 with this concept, the new stars of women's music. Yeah, she had a best-selling album in 1974, a little bit late. Okay. Most horrifying, we get something like this. Spin, the girl issue, which includes which included some of the women who were performing then all over the country, really articulating issues of womanhood, but they were always reduced to being as fragile or feminine or whatever as possible. And then you get something that's even more obscuring. Time. Macho music is out, empathy is in, and the all-female Lilith Festival is taking rock's new sound on the road. So this new sound comes 22 years after everybody else has started a movement Jewel never performed at Michigan. Lilith is not the first festival. Everything about this is, forgive me, alternative facts. Okay? And I'm sorry to say we just see no end of it. Every couple of years, somebody says, the new sound of feminist music, even my beloved Washington Post. Okay? Ouch. Street harassment, rape, this band has songs for all of that. 2016. Okay? So there is very little historical research. There's a lot of laziness. I finally got an article about, hey, 40 years of the women's music movement. And hey, women's music, you're turning 40. In Ms. Magazine, the soundtrack of lesbian feminism. Yeah. So I'm very proud of that. And that only took 100 years. And what's surprising is you will find terrific advocates in the strangest places. And indeed, some of them are sympathetic men. And it is great. So Parade, that little thing that comes in your newspaper, you don't think of that as a hotbed of radical insight. But groove on this. Somebody wrote in to Walter Scott's Parade. Why are the Runaways of recent movie fame presented as the first all-female rock group? Wasn't that Fanny? This is a really smart writer who knows about Fanny. And listen to the response. Oh yeah, but even before Fanny, there was Goldie and the Gingerbreads, the first all-woman rock band signed to a major record label, Decca, in 1963. And then he goes on to give a complete history like I just gave you. So Walter Scott, who knew? Long may he live. And likewise, in recent years, students have begun to write dissertations on this movement, and it's gotten a little bit more attention. Okay, just a few more things, and then I'll let you ask questions. While festival culture begins to burgeon, it's not enough to have two. We start having festivals in every state so that local women don't have to pay the expense of flying to Michigan or Illinois. So we had, by the late 80s, festivals in almost every state, including Alaska and Hawaii. And that included Camp Fest, the New England Women's Music Festival, the Maine Music Festival, Lone Star Women's Music Festival in Texas, Women Fest in New Mexico. Robin Tyler had two festivals, the West Coast and the Southern Women's Comedy and Music Fest. There was one in Mississippi, which was attacked by locals, and they were threatened violently. I worked there for 10 years, Camp Sister Spirit. A festival in Iowa, one in the Sister Space Pocono weekend in Pennsylvania. I'm leaving things out and I'm going to be killed. Oh, one in the Pacific Northwest. All of them were completely run by women with lighting and sound. And one of the most beautiful artifacts I own is one of Casey Cohen's light plots for how to light women on stage at the Michigan Festival. And that's down at the end of the table. So by 1999, I published the first book on women's music and festival culture. And I wanted to ask, why is this important to the audience? I wanted to highlight the performers and the producers. I wanted to give credit, but I was primarily interested in what the music meant to the women whose lives it changed. And starting from the mid-'80s, I would go to festivals, take notes, tape record everybody's comments at the mic, take photographs, and I also passed around a blank book. What does this culture mean to you? Why are you listening? Why are you here? How has it changed you? What will you remember? And I'll show you just an example. I filled up about 5 of these, just passing it around in a night stage audience with complete trust, saying, write what you want to say and then just bring it back to my towel at the end of the concert. And, other women were like partying and making out and having ice cream, and I'm doing homework in the dark, but I'm really glad I did. And on this one occasion, the very last page ended up, I loved everything about Michigan. Alice Walker. Sitting behind me, and I had no idea. So, Yeah, careful with that one, right? Okay. There's so much music that I could choose to play for you, and what I want to do is just point out a few things, and then I'm going to play two more samples, and then I'll let you ask questions. One of the things that's happened with women's music is it's really expanded internationally, meaning we have a feminist movement with women vocalizing their concerns now that we have do-it-yourself recording. So I have music from the Sami people, who used to be called Laplanders, indigenous to Scandinavia. A very famous album, Stop Excision, recorded by women in Malawi about the problem of female mutilation. And then a really important recording. This is the Irish band Zrazy. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, number 4. And I'll tell you what you're hearing. A little bit of a shock. Oh. 679-4700, 679-4700. The phone number. Okay. That is a disco hit of the phone number for abortion information in Ireland. It was illegal to publish that phone number in print, so they made a song that every woman would remember. That is one of the most brilliant contemporary returns to the oral tradition of the past. Can't print the number anywhere in a paper? Illegal to share? Hum it, 679-4700. Okay? Likewise, a really rad band that I love, Girls in the Nose, responded in one particular year. There was a real series of beloved women at the Michigan Festival who passed due to breast cancer. So a really rad band led by Kay Turner, who is a folklorist, made a rock hit out of How to Give Yourself a Breast Exam. And we'll just wrap it up with this. I love that I'm playing this in federal space.
Well, 1 in 10, the numbers grow, but the seed that's there, you don't need console, you need a breast exam. Go on and get a breast exam. I'm here to help you get right to it. I've got some hints, I know you're gonna get right through it. Learn to touch yourself now. A breast exam. You're lying there in your bed. Those sexy feelings that in your head. Go on, touch yourself now and give yourself a breast exam.
Okay, so she was giving instructions on how to make a breast exam erotic. Now you're not gonna find this, on public television. Okay. Well, I have so much more, but I'm really mindful that some of you might have questions. And I want to explain a little bit about the handout everyone got and offer a final fun thing. I tried to type up a little takeaway, but I also wanted folks to have this cartoon by Alison Bechdel, who, of course, now has a hit fun home at National Theater and on Broadway. I'm sorry, I have a few more. Yeah. In this panel, we see the awakening of the young woman, what is necessary to the young woman coming out in college, and Bechdel's age, and she and I are the same age, where you have to be reading Gynecology by Mary Daly, and you're listening to Alex Dobkin, The Woman in Your Life, on the turntable. So it's a really terrific expression of how the cultural material of the time cannot be separated from the awakening experience. And I am so sorry, 1 second, to pass that back to folks who didn't get one. Uh-oh. And what I'd like to offer is, before you leave today, I have this tiny, rare thing, a stamp I bought at my very first Michigan festival, Harmony Through Women's Music. And I can stamp your little program if you want. That is something that's not being manufactured much anymore. So where does it all go from here? I've donated quite a few items, in particular Woody Simmons' Oregon Mountains, which is so great, Maxine Feldman's Closet Sale, some back issues of Hot Wire, one of Casey's Light Plots, the Lady Slipper catalog, which distributed through secret mail, all this music. Donated a whole lot of that to the Library of Congress, but my whole collection is willed to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, and they came to me, which is really nice. And they are now in the business of beginning to digitize the 380 recordings, all of which are on cassettes, that I made over the past 30 years, interviewing artists and taping sounds at festivals. So plenty of work ahead, and I will pause there, and thank you very much. Oh, yes. Who has a question? Nobody? Let me put on my professorial-looking glasses. Yes, hi.
And where do you see women's music today? Oh, that's right.
Yeah, well, the problem, as I see it, is that before we can properly credit and praise the women who created all this, we're in an overlap moment where the focus is very much on trans rights, and there's a big backlash with, if you Google different aspects of women's music, younger women are sort of interrogating it as it's not inclusionary, you know. So there's a kind of generational dismissal, and I think in another 10 years, people are going to come back and go, oh my God, I wish I could have gone to Michigan. I'm going to be like, uh-huh. But the thing about people who are now second generation, Kathleen Hanna and La Tigra is still doing concerts that have like a little women's history spin. Then we have women, you know, who are very proud to identify as feminist on the airwaves. We have very different versions of all of this with different new artists. And thank you for coming. We have lots of different movements in different countries that are just beginning to dare to record. So some of the stuff I put out there, all female orchestra in Afghanistan dares to defy the Taliban. Okay, so women are finding a way to pass along statements of change in different means across cultures. So there's going to be much more. Obviously, I have this ancient kind of tech, so I can listen to all my old tapes and my albums and my CDs. I don't even own an iPod. I'm really 20th century, but I'm also mindful that many women are beginning to pass. We've lost Kay Gardner, Ronnie Gilbert, etc. So my job is to run around the country as energetically as possible and archive everybody. And I'm hoping next to do a book on women who did feminist radio shows. And I've been invited by Pacifica Radio Archives to do a book based on their material. So I'm going to California in May, and I'm going to live there for a while. And I'm actually being interviewed on KPFK in LA Saturday night. This is Wednesday, right? Next question. Yeah. Hi.
The Women's Music Festival often had controversies.
Yep.
Can you talk about that?
Sure, all of them always did. In the beginning, it was, should men be allowed? Then, boy children. Then, what about smoking? Then, what about, leather and etc. practices? What about the problem of racism? What about women who couldn't afford to attend, who tried to sneak in? Then what about keeping it safe for children as more mommies brought babies and other women were still desperately trying to party? Then the question of, do you openly encourage trans women, or do you have, in the case of Michigan, a primarily clothing optional festival that a lot of women went to heal from sexual assault and didn't want to see anyone with male genitalia? That was written up in cyberspace in really brutal ways, which were not fair to the festival. Other festivals always had men attending or were open to anybody because they were primarily clothed or in a dorm or a university space. My dad went to Sister Fire. He took his shirt off and got yelled at and was told, hey, we can't, so you can't. And boy, he learned that day. My mom went to 9 different festivals with me. That's how I ended up writing an article about mothers at festivals. She's a very beautiful woman. She was hit on, and she had to just walk around with her wedding ring out like this. She went to Michigan, 2 nationals, 2 Camp Fests, 2 Virginias, 1 Sister Fire. And she was able to meet Ronnie Gilbert, who was one of the few artists of her generation or older, and they spoke to each other in Yiddish, which was so cool. As fast as I can write the Wikipedia page for the Michigan Festival, somebody comes in and rewrites it negatively, so it's a constant struggle. And my argument in my latest book, The Disappearing L, is that it's difficult to keep up the pace when at the touch of a button someone can vilify a culture and send it to millions, as opposed to the limited archives that we're trying to get online that are really accurate, which have to be vetted by people who are still at risk of losing their jobs if they come out. And the photos within festival culture often included nudity. How do you get everyone's permission? What about children of moms who were dragged to festivals against their will and are now conservative? I mean, it's really a sort of historian's, I don't want to say nightmare because I love it. It's a challenge. It's a workout. And being fair to everyone is a constant moral test for me. That's a great question. Yeah, hi.
Hi. Can you name some of the punk bands that you feel are important in the history? And also, how do you feel that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland treats this subject?
Oh my God, it's so frustrating, very frustrating. I'm glad you asked about punk. We put punk in the display. Pretty in Punk is a book I've taught. That's there. Punk bands, my golly, everything from Team Dresch, Tribe 8, La Tigre. Hang on a second. They're in that film about Seattle. Oh boy, I don't have this written down in front of me. 7 Year Bitch. Okay. A lot of them have playful names, and you have to really go into the Lady Slipper catalog to see some of the rare ones. The Yeasty Girls, Brat Attack. There's quite a few compilations that I have. They're amazing, but that was controversial. That was seen as scary to a lot of women who really wanted women's music to be gentle and sweet. And Lynn Breedlove, who was the lead singer in Tribe 8, and the title is a sly play on tribadism, ancient Greek term for lesbian lovemaking. Tribe 8 had a spokeswoman who said, we may offend because we're loud and angry, but we're all rape survivors. And when we jump around on stage and yell a lot, we feel better. And that's their presentation. their presentation allowed a lot of other women to get up and do a mosh pit, which then had to be constructed at Michigan. And that was controversial because what about the women in wheelchairs who were right down front and they couldn't really mosh and the dust was getting, I mean, it was, how is everyone included? What if you wanted to dive, do a stage dive, you know, and you were paraplegic? How do we accommodate that? Okay. How is everyone included? Yeah. And the first time I dove off the stage and, you know, was carried around on everyone's shoulders, screaming and yelling in my plaid flannel shirt, it was just heaven on earth. The next time I landed on my head because people were distracted and I realized, yeah, this could not be good. But that was part of making sure at Michigan in particular, which is really the gold standard, every genre of music. You would have salsa and big band and instrumental, you had comedy, you had blues and Latina and jazz, and you had in particular international groups, everyone from representing Maori, New Zealand to China, Hawaii. One of my favorite experiences was Native American band Ulali, and they are just one of quite a few that played there. So having everybody, but punk definitely. And the latest years that would have included, well, kind of a combination of rap. I would say more rap than punk. Goddess and She, Crudas Cubensi, which is from Cuba, and then really astounding impresario performers. Anyway, it's a great question, and I have much more. I just have to do a little looking up of facts. Yeah.
This sort of a follow-up. I was thinking of asking about genre.
Mm-hmm.
When you mentioned Holly Near,
Yeah.
I mean, she's sort of, to most people, and probably including me, who's not part of this community, sort of embodies the idea
Mm-hmm.
of what women's music
Yeah.
is. But my question, and as you've implied, that's probably largely constructed by the mainstream
Mm-hmm.
audience in certain ways. To what extent was there any sense of a musical taste or sound within this?
What an awesome question. Okay, so here I have on the table Kay Gardner, Sounding the Inner Landscape. And Kay was a performer, played the flute, was very popular, also played on Alex Dobkin's album Lavender Jane Loves Women. Kay argues as a, you know, musicologist that there is a specific female sound and a kind of circular sound structure in women's performance. And she gets very academic with how, if you look at ancient culture, the sound for what is holy is both the first sounds we're capable to make as infants and how the sacred Hebrew word for God, Yahweh, is just A-E-I-O-U, Yahweh, right? And many other theories. That is a certain kind of sound. Women who were looking for something more physically akin to a drum beat often complained that, you know, women's music was not for them, but then they created and added in. And one of my favorite performers, Sue Fink, very famously said, I don't think we have women's music, we have a women's music audience. So that women would show up, the same women would show up for very different styles once they were, you know, available. And I think that's still true. And the interesting thing about Holly's music, Holly recorded a lot of songs about, you know, Nicaragua and so forth, that maybe you're not going to play while you're relaxing in the bathtub because, you know, they have the intention of anthems, get up and join a work brigade, you know, and then other music, the performer would not be as political on stage, but might also be less verbose and more a different kind of sound. And I eventually became friends with all these people and became, you know, a biographer of my heroines, which is a really great job, but a big responsibility. So how everybody wants to be remembered, they all want to be remembered as broader in range than they are stereotypes. Yeah, Philip, hi.
This may be really specific, but What was it about The Changer and the Change that made it such a breakout hit, or made it such a big album during its time?
Well, it had all of these anthems, Sweet Woman, Rising Inside. I mean, very explicit songs about women in love with each other. And then, Song of the Soul, where everybody's singing together. We'll sing this song. Stuff that made everyone, both the particular, I'm in love with someone specific, and the movement, there's a whole lot of women like me. That, I think, both the individual feeling of awakening and somebody who was, again, trained as a composer and a classical pianist who had amazing skill and still is performing. She's got a new album out now. And that was also sort of an event. Like, you would then wait to go to this concert, and what happened in the audience was as important as what was going on stage. And, it was like that for me. I saw my first concert at the Bayou under the bridge in Georgetown. It's an ice cream parlor now. And even in my first concert, I was writing in my journal. And in my latest book, I talk about that. It's rude to write through an artist's performance, but I wanted to describe everything, because what if it stopped at any moment? Nobody was writing about it. No one was publishing that I knew. It could disappear at any moment. And I write that I just wanted to bottle it like wine. How many other people were feeling like me? And everyone in the audience was. So that kind of shared experience was very well captured in the sort of harmonies that Chris created. And all of the people on that album are just stellar. And then the critique that it was a very white band, and some of the main performers were as well, was answered by Olivia, which put on a tour in '75, The Varied Voices of Black Women, which took Linda Tillery and Mary Watkins and Pat Parker and Gwen Avery and others on tour around the Bay Area and beyond. And some of that is in the other exhibit too. So the appeal of Changer and the Change, I think, is a combination of artistry, and that the lyrics speak to anybody who is coming into what was unspeakable, falling in love with another woman. Yeah. So, yes, out of time. I am out of time. What can I do? I can stand here, thank you, and take questions personally. Okay. Thank you all. This was a wonderful experience.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.